The M23 rebel group, with alleged backing from Rwanda, has recently seized Goma, the capital of North Kivu province in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, this marks the most significant escalation in the region since M23's previous capture of Goma in 2012. Now, the group aims to consolidate control over Goma, nearby mineral-rich areas, and surrounding supply lines. The UN reports that 3,000 to 4,000 Rwandan troops are fighting alongside M23 in the eastern DRC and de facto control M23 operations. Now, the ongoing conflict threatens to escalate into a regional war given Burundi's support for the DRC and Uganda's alleged support for M23. Now, looking at the complex web of, regional alliances and the severe humanitarian impact, what steps can be taken by the international community and regional actors to de-escalate the conflict and also address the root causes driving the M23 rebel or the rebellion? Now, joining us on the show, we have Paul Nantulya. He's a senior researcher, U.S. National Defense University, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
All right, Paul, let's take a look at, this particular issue. It's been, one that has been in discussions for a while now. And from what we know, in 2012, we saw international pressure, particularly from the African Union and regional states, leading to M23's withdrawal. Now, looking at the different geopolitical landscape, today, that's obtainable today, and the current resurgence of M23 compared to their 2012 takeover of Goma, what are the chances of history repeating itself?
Well, as you correctly mentioned, the geostrategic environment today is very different from what it was back in 2012 when the M23 seized Goma. A number of issues to point out. First, the M23 can really strictly no longer be described as a militia. It is much larger, it's much more organized, it has better weaponry. I mean, they're using combat drones, they're using sophisticated artillery systems, missile systems, and so on. And they operate and behave like a regular conventional army. I mean, they're conducting conventional operations. So that's the first thing that has changed from 2012. The second thing that has changed from 2012 is international attention. Right now, the international community is sucked into other conflicts. There's Ukraine, Russia, there's the Gaza situation, and many other situations that are taking the attention of the international community. So that's the other thing that has changed. The international community and the African community, as well as the Southern African Development Community and the East African Cooperation, are not pulling with one voice. Back in 2012, all these parts of the international community, because African countries are also part of the international community, sometimes we tend to forget, we're pulling with one voice. But right now, that's not the case. So from what is happening on the ground, Goma is effectively under M23 control. That means that the North Kivu province, which, as you point out, is a mineral-rich province, is effectively under the control of the M23. And, I think it's important for your readers to recall that the M23 made this attack in three prongs. The first prong was Goma. The second prong is Bukavu. And indeed, we've seen reports that are suggesting that the M23 is currently moving southward. And I expect over the next 24 to 48 hours, I expect very serious clashes between them and the Burundian military, which deployed into South Kivu to battle their own rebels. So it's becoming a regional conflict. There's another prong that's moving along the Rusizi plain, which faces Bujumbura. which is Burundi's economic capital. So we are already seeing a regional conflagration of this crisis.
Okay. Now, if you are a researcher, and if you also recall, in 2012, Rwanda was pressured into cutting ties with M23, after UN reports, confirmed its involvement. Now we're seeing, Rwanda seems to be emboldened. Has the regional power dynamic shifted in Rwanda's favor? What do you believe is Rwanda's strategic endgame in this conflict?
Well, I don't believe that Southern Africa has the capacity to actually speak with one voice on this issue. Now, they met in Zimbabwe, in Harare, on Friday, and they came up with a communique where they basically said that the members of the community had noted the seriousness of the issue and were sending a team into Congo to make sure that the SADC forces are safe. Because 14 SADC peacekeepers, most of them South African, have lost their lives in this offensive, right? But nothing more than that. And I think it's important to recall that there are 5,000 Rwandese troops in Mozambique that are battling an insurgency, an Islamist insurgency in Mozambique, right? That is something that it's an initiative that Rwanda took, right? Which naturally is going to make it very difficult for SADC to speak with one voice against the M23 that is believed to be backed by Rwanda. All right. So the regional environment has basically changed. Back in 2012, Rwanda was not in any of these Southern African Development Community countries. Today, Rwanda is shouldering a major counter-insurgency effort in Mozambique, right? And Mozambique is a major SADC member, has a strong voice within SADC. So, as I mentioned in my report that was released, I think like 5 days ago or something, I mentioned that between 2012 and 2025, Rwanda has engaged in some major regional and international diplomatic efforts that seem to have been a preemptive strike against the isolation that it faced. Rwanda faced some serious isolation in 2012, right? And Rwanda seems to have engaged in diplomacy, targeted diplomacy, to make sure that it does not end up in a situation of isolation that it experienced back in 2012. And I think Southern Africa has been a critically important area. But we've seen the Rwandese and the South African presidents, they've exchanged a war of words. Of course, in South Africa, I mean, I've been talking to colleagues on the ground in South Africa who feel particularly aggrieved by the death of those soldiers, right? So it remains to be seen how South Africa will respond, how SADC will respond to the killing of those peacekeepers. SADC also has its own problems, right? It has its own situations that it's trying to resolve. It will be interesting to see what comes out of that. But certainly, this crisis, a lot of people have warned that this crisis, including myself, have warned that this crisis will take on regional dimensions. It is already a regional crisis.
All right, but then the European Union, is under pressure to freeze its that's Rwanda's mineral trade deal with Rwanda, right? At about now. So this is because of its alleged support for the M23. Now, could cutting off trade with Rwanda, could it force Rwanda to double down on its position?
Well, if theoretically speaking, and some people are talking about Tanzania, which about 70% of Rwanda's goods traverse Tanzanian ports, that if Tanzania exerts an embargo of some kind to prevent Rwanda from conducting external trade and prevent Rwanda from importing, then that might be the point of pressure. But I don't see Tanzania doing that. I don't see Tanzania doing that. President Kagame has a very good personal relationship with President Samia Hassan Suluhu. He has invested a lot in these sorts of relationships. He also has a very, very strong relationship with President William Ruto of Kenya, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to enact, I mean, the East African community has enacted an embargo before, and that was against Burundi, right? To try and reverse a coup in Burundi, right? That took place in the 1990s, right? But even that kind of decision would have to be arrived at through a summit. Well, first of all, ministerial meeting, and then a summit, which would then take a decision. These summits take decisions on the basis of a simple majority, right? It would be difficult, I mean, things can change, and one is not a prophet, but it would be difficult to see the East African community marshal a simple majority to enact an embargo like that on Rwanda.
Okay.
So I still think that there's going to be need for very creative diplomacy to try and persuade Rwanda this time, because Rwanda seems to have dug in, right?
Rwanda isn't the only country that has been accused. Uganda has also been accused of aiding both the DRC government and also M23 in different capacities. Are there signs that Uganda is playing a double game to secure its own economic interest in the Eastern Congo's minerals?
Uganda has been very quiet. I think in this whole crisis, people are basically saying that Rwanda is the big elephant in the room. I don't think Rwanda is the big elephant in the room, because everybody knows Rwanda's position.
But Uganda is playing both sides.
Yes, I think the big elephant in the room is Uganda, right? Given that a cohort of M23, the biggest cohort, in 2012, when the M23 was defeated, a cohort went to Rwanda and it was disarmed and cantoned, right? And actually, some of their leaders ended up at the International Criminal Court, right? That was a major step. But the biggest cohort ended up in Uganda, and they were disarmed, and they were taken to the military base, Bihanga military base in Western Uganda, right? But then in 2014, they vanished from that base and somehow ended up back in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? And that led to a lot of anger and a lot of tension in Kinshasa that was demanding questions as to how these M23 that had been disarmed and were located on this military base could just vanish without Ugandan knowledge, right? We all know the kind of security that, on a military base, you've got a lot of intelligence, you've got a lot of security and so on, right? So Uganda is the biggest elephant in the room. How will Uganda react? Will Uganda coordinate with Rwanda? Will Uganda just tolerate what Rwanda is doing? Has there been diplomatic initiative? I mean, we do know that there's been a lot of exchanges between Uganda and Rwandese defense officials at the highest level. I mean, this took place months leading to this seizure of Goma by the M23. So Uganda is the biggest elephant in the room. And
all right, now speaking of diplomatic, initiatives, or the biggest elephant in the room, China has also invested billions in the DRC's mining sector and also maintains close ties with Kinshasa. Now, can you tell us, how is China involved? Does it play any role in the M23 crisis? Do you know of any role that it plays?
Yes, China does. China does. In 2007, China did bring the DRC and Rwanda together, but very, very quietly, because there are lots of Chinese companies, oil companies, mineral companies, that are operational in both North and South Kivu, right? And those investments sometimes are under threat by these rebel movements, right? So one would not be surprised to see China playing that role once more, trying to bring the Rwandese and the Congolese together to hammer out some sort of agreement to ensure that Chinese activities, especially in the mining sector, are secured. So China, certainly, I would expect China to play some kind of role, but it's not going to be a public role. Just like what happened in 2007, it will really be behind the scenes. And we have seen China play this kind of role in many other African situations. China coming in, Chinese diplomats coming in to ensure that these economic activities are not threatened. But like I say, Uganda is the biggest elephant in the room. How Uganda chooses to respond could play a major role.
Yeah. So you're saying that you're also saying that China could exert pressure on the Congolese government to stabilize the region.
Both. China has done that before, exerted pressure, but behind the scenes, exerted pressure on both Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo to kind of try and seek a settlement in order to protect Chinese mining interests in both North and South Kivu, because now the rebels are now moving south. From what we hear from media reports, and also what I'm hearing from reports on the ground.
All right. Now let's quickly touch on, humanitarian consequences of the M23's takeover of Goma. Now, we know that hospitals in eastern Congo are reporting over 700 deaths and 3,000 injured since January 26th. Displacement is rising rapidly, with hundreds of thousands fleeing as well. How are humanitarian organizations responding? And, would you say that the international aid that they are receiving is sufficient?
No. The international aid and the African aid that humanitarian workers are receiving is not enough. They're working under very, very difficult circumstances. The World Health Organization estimates that at least 700 people have died in that offensive. The numbers could be much higher. And that's because, it's not easy to have information access to what's going on the ground. Electricity was cut off, water was cut off. And so what we're seeing is the beginning of a major surge of displaced persons. Because remember that Goma was already hosting displaced persons, because this area has been under tension for a very long time, right? It was already hosting displaced persons. Now these persons have now been displaced again. And so some are moving across the border into
Rwanda and Uganda,
and some are now beginning to move into Uganda, with UNICEF and so on. And others are moving further south to South Kivu. And as we've mentioned, there's already a rebel column that is moving towards South Kivu. So I was speaking to somebody from Bukavu yesterday who was saying that they are just expecting the worst, where you have displaced persons from Goma, and then you're going to have new displacements in Bukavu itself. And those displacements now are going to move into Burundi. So as I mentioned earlier, this is already a regional crisis. It's a regional crisis. And the assistance that is coming from African countries, because I think it's important to remember that African countries also send assistance into the Democratic Republic of Congo, but it's not enough. And what the international community is sending in is also not enough.
Speaking of these assistance, MONUSCO, has a $1 billion annual budget, but they have been criticized, as ineffective as well.
Well, the thing is, it's one thing to criticize MONUSCO for being ineffective, but MONUSCO was asked to withdraw. The Congolese government asked MONUSCO to withdraw. So as we speak right now, right, MONUSCO has a very thin presence on the ground in Bukavu. All these bases that MONUSCO had are being turned over to the Congolese military. So it's one thing to accuse MONUSCO, right? But MONUSCO has two hands behind its back because it was asked to leave. And so MONUSCO, this crisis has erupted at a time when MONUSCO has been orchestrating a withdrawal from the Democratic Republic of Congo. This was not the case in 2012, right? So again, it's a major humanitarian crisis, because one of the things that MONUSCO is mandated to do is civilian protection. especially in times like this. But MONUSCO does not have the capacity and the capability because it was asked to withdraw.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think, those that are accusing MONUSCO need to make up their mind. Because this is a peacekeeping mission that is not able to do its work because it was asked to leave.
So it would have made a huge difference if the presence of MONUSCO was still in the DRC.
I think MONUSCO could have helped. I think it's a bit much to expect that MONUSCO would have done everything. You see, I think part of the reason, my sister, part of the problem we have is that there's a confusion about what a peacekeeping mission does.
Yeah.
A peacekeeping mission is not a combat mission. There are over 120 rebel groups that are operating in North and South Kivu. And I think it's a bit much to expect that MONUSCO will combat all these rebel groups and pacify the area. A peacekeeping mission positions itself between belligerents in a process of negotiating a ceasefire. It's not a combat operation. So I think MONUSCO is being criticized for what it is not. A peacekeeping mission is not a combat mission, right? So some of this criticism, personally, I think some of this criticism of MONUSCO, I think, is unwarranted. And because it is based on a poor understanding of what a peacekeeping mission is supposed to do. That's number one, point number one. Point number two, it was asked to withdraw. So what is MONUSCO supposed to do?
Okay. So now the DRC's mining sector, accounts for like 95% of its exports as well. So if instability continues, do you think that global tech and automotive industries will suffer due to disruptions in cobalt and coltan supply chains?
I think it will. I think it will. I think it will. I think, the DRC is critical in the clean energy transition. The DRC is plays a critical role in the global EV battery, EV supply chain, right? So this conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo also has global implications. It doesn't just have regional implications. It also has global implications because there are Chinese miners in the area, right? You also have companies from other parts of the world. You've got Western companies in there. You've got companies from all over the world, right? That are involved in one way or the other in North and South Kivu. I think those investments are under risk. Those supply chains are under risk. So the situation in the DRC, like I write in my report, what happens in Congo doesn't stay in Congo. It spreads and it metastasizes, right? And it's going to engulf the region. It's already engulfing the region, right? But it also has important global implications. And that's the reason why a initiative, African-led initiative with serious international backing is absolutely necessary at this point in time.
Okay. Now, let's talk about, the possibility of a ceasefire. Now, the AU brokered a ceasefire in Ethiopia's Tigray conflict. And we also know that France and Belgium have historically, they have historical ties with both Rwanda, and the DRC respectively. Now, is it possible for them to, play a more active diplomatic role and also, push for a similar diplomatic work that they did in, in Ethiopia? Will it work in DRC?
The quick answer is yes. So as I note in my report, the problem in the DRC is not the lack of, it's not the lack of a framework. There's a framework in place already, right? Now, if we go back to the Sun City Accord, which was signed at the end of the Inter-Congolese dialogue. The Inter-Congolese dialogue took about 60 days. I was there from beginning to end. And I was part of a technical team that was supporting the mediator, the late President Ketumila Masire of Botswana, and also supporting President Thabo Mbeki, right, who was also part of, actually President Mbeki, to his credit, He sat in those meetings from beginning to end. I mean, I'm a witness to that. So that process was designed to settle the internal crisis, because there's an internal dynamic to this problem. There's an internal dynamic and there's an external dynamic. The internal dynamic has a lot to do with democratization. It has a lot to do with citizenship, nationality, right, of these Congolese of Rwandan ethnicity and so on. This was covered under the inter-Congolese dialogue that was signed, right? Then you had the external dimension, which was the Lusaka peace process. The Lusaka peace process sought to address the external involvement, because, you know, there were over 7 armies that were involved on different sides in the Congolese crisis. And this was designed to arrive at a ceasefire and involving the African Union and the United Nations. And peace-building institutions were created to advance both the inter-Congolese, the peace that resulted from the inter-Congolese dialogue and the peace that resulted from the Lusaka peace process. Fortunately, I was a witness to both, and I saw how effective they could be, right? Because the 2006 Congolese elections were conducted under the aegis of the inter-Congolese dialogue and the Lusaka peace process, right? So the processes that President William Ruto of Kenya, the Nairobi process, and his Angolan counterpart, President Lorenzo, what they're doing is basically building on that institutional memory of the inter-Congolese dialogue and the Lusaka peace process. So there's already a framework. The question is there political will? Is there initiative, right? This is something that African countries must take initiative, and there must be political will to arrive at a settlement. So the two missing ingredients, in my opinion, are African initiative and a political will on the part of the actors involved. But when you listen to what is coming out of Kigali and what is coming out of Kinshasa, one does not get a sense that there's sufficient political will, right? But this is not the first time that African countries have been confronted with a crisis that seems intractable. There's a lot of experience on the African continent. You know, Nigeria plays a critically important role in peace initiatives. So I think it's a question of initiative, and it's also a question of political will. Otherwise, the framework is there. There is a framework in place.
Okay. Now, just for your closing thoughts now, some have actually, brought out the best case scenario and the worst case scenario of this particular, regional war. Now, best case scenario is a negotiated settlement with M23, right? And worst case scenario is a full-scale regional war, reminiscent of the Great African War that happened between 1998 and 2003. So what can be done now to avoid the worst outcomes?
What needs to happen is that there needs to be an African-led process. As I mentioned earlier, there needs to be an African-led process. African countries need to move with a sense of urgency. And I would say countries like Nigeria in particular, because Nigeria will be seen as an even-handed actor, an actor that does not have an interest in the outcome, an actor that is not in the theater of these hostilities, right? I would say that Nigeria is very well placed, right, to work with the African Union to bring on board countries like Ghana, countries like Senegal, to devise an African-led process, right, that can lead to the beginning of a process, right? South Africa punches well above its weight when it comes to conflict resolution. Unfortunately, this time around, South Africa and Rwanda are engaged in a diplomatic crisis. In fact, they've both threatened each other militarily, right? And so that's why Nigeria's role, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Kenya perhaps, become extremely important in moving this process forward. And like I said before, the institutional memory is there. So that's what I would expect. But if that does not happen, then we're going to see some kind of return to that 7-country war that we saw in the 1990s. It's already happening.
Well, we definitely hope that, all African countries come together to, mediate and put an end to this particular war. We'd have to wrap up the conversation right now. Thank you so much, Paul Nantulya, a senior researcher, U.S. National Defense University, Washington, D.C., for joining us and speaking to us on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.